Very kind of severe language, if you will. The Vice Commerce Minister yesterday saying that they can't negotiate with a knife against their throat. There's certainly no sense that we're going to see any sort of movement at this point.
Well, I think you point to a couple of key takeaways from what we heard yesterday from this press conference by 5 different ministries trying to present this united front. And as you say, what they outlined was what they said was an intellectual property regime that they said is not problematic. And also, when asked about forced tech transfers by one of the journalists in the audience, saying, well, joint ventures are valid under WTO rules, and suggesting that they are not written into law, this forced tech transfers. These are 2 issues that, of course, are central and at the heart of the concerns coming out of the Trump administration. The fact that China is not even acknowledging that they're a problem suggests that they're very far away from drawing up solutions or proposals to address those concerns from the Trump administration. In terms of intellectual property, look, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the regime here is more robust than it has been in previous years, but it's still, many would say, disingenuous to suggest that it's on the same level as those in the European Union or the US. And in terms of forced tech transfers, the law often doesn't match with reality here in China. So even if it's not written into law, many executives have told us that forced tech transfer still continues. The other thing that we heard yesterday was a fleshing out of these proposals to shore up China's economy in the eventuality that this trade war continues, around boosting consumption, boosting infrastructure, spending, cutting taxes and fees. So certainly the sense you got from the white paper that was published over the weekend and from this press conference was that China is cementing its position and becoming less flexible, not more.
And do they have a point, given the importance of the Made in China 2025 policy? How important is this for the long-term growth of the Chinese economy?
Well, from the Chinese perspective, like Tom was outlining, they point to industrial strategies elsewhere in the world. Germany is a case in point, and of course, other economic historians would point you towards Japan and South Korea. But nonetheless, though, it's not just America that does have these concerns with China. Plenty of big industrialized nations around the world share similar complaints. They complain about market access, or lack of market access, I should say. They complain about when they do get in that they do have to make these joint venture arrangements, that they do have to share technology and IP, and that they don't get the protection that they need in response. So I think more broadly speaking, the US is certainly leading this trade dispute with China and is also, of course, tangled up in plenty of other trade disputes around the world. But there is a much broader undercurrent of support, I think, for some movement and some action towards China, even though, of course, as Tom outlined, China doesn't agree with those complaints.
Tom, so if for the time being we can't envision a way out of this trade dispute, what are Chinese executives on the ground telling you about how they're positioning themselves for the next few years?
Well, that's really interesting. Increasingly, we're hearing from executives that we talk to here that they are shifting their focus away from investments in the United States and towards the Southeast Asian region and to some extent Europe as well. And of course, a key concern for them is the retooling of CFIUS in the US, which will give that committee greater oversight of Chinese investments in America. They are deeply concerned about that, and that is changing the way they look at potential opportunities. So certainly Southeast Asia and Europe could benefit in terms of Chinese investment as they shift away from the US.
And, I thought one of the interesting things to come out of the Ministry of Commerce press conference yesterday was they were at pains to point out that despite total trade and GDP numbers, that China's GDP per capita was still relatively low. So is there a sense that, they're essentially still trying to play the developing economy card, that they think that this, I guess, de facto subsidy that's been in place for the last, say, 20 years should stay in place?
Well, this is a key line of defence that China does use, that they are still a developing economy. They are still on the path to being rich nation status. But I think the counterpoint that other rival economies make is that China has now reached a position of scale and economic weight in the world economy where those rules no longer can be applied to it, that it needs to adjust itself and operate on a kind of a level playing field with the rest of the world. And that's why there is a feeling that if Donald Trump could sort of reach an agreement with his trade disputes with key allies such as Canada, such as his trade tensions with Europe. He's just pulled off a trade deal with South Korea. And if he can get Japan on board, that there is a view that there is an alliance out there that could build a case against China to change their outlook now that they have reached the economic size that they have, and make clear that the WTO rules of old no longer apply to them. But like you said, Heidi, China, of course, doesn't take that viewpoint, and they continue to affirm that they are a poor country still on the path to being a rich one.
And on the other hand, how would the trade negotiations with China, could they have an impact on how the U.S. deals with other trade negotiations, such as with Japan? Of course, the U.S. keeps pushing for a bilateral FTA, something that Japan doesn't want.
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I think the China one is probably a little bit separate from the rest of them because ultimately, the US concerns with China are about the structural design of China's economy, its industrial strategy for going forward, and the role of state sponsorship. With Japan, with Europe, with Canada and Mexico, it's ultimately an argument about trade, so to speak, about cutting a deal over the buying and selling of goods. That's why I think the China one is a bit separate, and that's why there's a view out there among many analysts that it'll be a much more protracted trade dispute, even if in the interim the US can cut deals with other nations like Japan, as you just mentioned, and like the deal that they just agreed this week with South Korea.